Every parent knows the sound of a child's desperate cry. It cuts through walls, through noise, straight to the heart. On this particular night at City General's understaffed clinic, Nurse Ellen Morrison had heard plenty of cries in her 30 years of service, but none quite like this one. A small black girl stood trembling at the locked door to the supply rooms, tears streaming down her cheeks as she pleaded with anyone who would listen. "My mom's inside! Please, my mom's inside!" The child's voice carried the kind of raw terror that makes seasoned nurses stop everything and pay attention. Ellen had seen enough broken families, enough desperate situations, to know that nothing good waited behind that door. Yet something in the little girl's eyes, a fierce loyalty, an unshakable love, reminded her of feelings she'd buried long ago. What could drive a mother to hide in a medical supply closet with her child waiting outside? Before we jump back, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The worn brass key on Ellen Morrison's keychain had opened thousands of doors over 3 decades, but tonight it felt heavier than usual as she stood in the fluorescent-lit hallway of City General's community clinic. The tarnished nursing pin on her scrubs, a 30-year service award that had lost its shine somewhere around year 15, caught the harsh overhead light as she reached for the key ring. At 62, Ellen had perfected the art of clinical detachment. Her graying hair pulled back in a practical bun, her movements efficient and measured, she navigated the night shift with the quiet competence of someone who had seen it all. The clinic served the forgotten corners of the city, where insurance was a luxury and emergencies were a way of life. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was necessary work, and Ellen had built her identity around being indispensable. The building itself showed its age. Linoleum floors worn smooth by decades of desperate feet, walls painted in that particular shade of institutional green that seemed designed to drain hope from anyone who looked at it too long. The waiting room chairs, mismatched donations from hospitals that could afford newer furniture, bore the stains and scars of countless worried vigils. This was healthcare at its most basic level, stripped of pretense and polish, where the only currency that mattered was human need. Ellen's co-workers had become her closest approximation to family. Dr. Roberto Martinez, fresh out of residency and still carrying the idealism that the system hadn't yet ground out of him, worked the overnight shifts while studying for his specialty boards. His youthful energy both inspired and exhausted Ellen. She remembered having that fire once, before years of bureaucracy and budget cuts had banked her own flames to mere embers. Frank Kowalski, the night security guard, represented the other end of the spectrum. Pushing 70 with a permanent limp from his construction days, Frank had seen enough of the world's ugliness to approach each shift with weary pragmatism. Yet beneath his gruff exterior lived a man who kept spare sandwiches in his locker for the homeless patients who wandered in, seeking shelter as much as medical care. Another quiet night, Frank had joked earlier, settling into his chair by the main entrance. Both he and Ellen knew better than to say such things aloud. It was an invitation for chaos. But Tuesday nights in late autumn carried a particular stillness, as if the city itself was holding its breath before winter's arrival. Ellen's personal life existed in the spaces between shifts, a careful choreography of solitude punctuated by routine. Her one-bedroom apartment 10 minutes from the hospital contained the accumulated remnants of a marriage that had dissolved under the weight of her dedication to other people's emergencies. David had left 15 years ago, citing her emotional unavailability and the job that consumed not just her nights, but her capacity for connection. The divorce had been civil, almost businesslike, another symptom of the emotional distance that had grown between them like scar tissue. They had divided their possessions with the same clinical efficiency Ellen brought to triage, each item catalogued and distributed without the messiness of sentiment. The only battle had been over their daughter Sarah, and even that had been more bureaucratic than passionate. Sarah was 34 now, a successful marketing executive in Seattle with a life carefully constructed 3,000 miles away from her mother's influence. Their conversations had dwindled to birthday calls and Christmas cards, each interaction polite and hollow. Ellen kept Sarah's college graduation photo in her locker, not out of sentimentality, but as a reminder of opportunities missed and words left unspoken. The irony wasn't lost on Ellen that she had spent decades caring for other people's children. While her own grew up feeling neglected, she had been present for countless family crises, had held strangers' hands through their darkest hours, had advocated fiercely for patients who couldn't advocate for themselves. Yet when Sarah had needed her, really needed her, Ellen had always been at work, addressing someone else's emergency. The clinic's challenges were as familiar as her own reflection. Budget cuts had reduced staffing to skeleton crews, forcing nurses to handle patient loads that would have been considered dangerous in better-funded facilities. Equipment broke down and stayed broken until someone could find creative funding solutions. The pharmacy was perpetually understocked, forcing difficult decisions about which medications could be dispensed and which would have to wait for the next shipment. Ellen had adapted to these constraints with the resourcefulness that came from necessity. She knew which supplies could be stretched, which protocols could be bent without compromising patient safety, and which battles were worth fighting with the administration. Her reputation among both staff and patients rested on competence rather than warmth. She was the nurse you wanted in a crisis, even if you might not seek her out for comfort. The night shift suited her temperament and her life circumstances. While day shift bustled with the energy of new beginnings and fresh starts, nights carried a different rhythm. The patients who arrived after midnight often came with stories too complicated for daylight hours. Domestic violence victims waiting until their abusers fell asleep, addicts in various stages of withdrawal, elderly people whose loneliness had become a medical emergency. Ellen had learned to read between the lines of their presentations, to see the human stories behind the medical complaints. The chest pain that was really anxiety about eviction notices, the chronic headaches that masked the stress of working 3 jobs to keep food on the table, the accidents that followed patterns too consistent to be coincidental. Yet for all her professional insight, Ellen struggled to apply the same compassionate analysis to her own life. She could diagnose complex family dynamics in her patients, while remaining blind to the patterns in her own relationships. She could advocate fiercely for a stranger's child, while letting years pass without meaningful contact with her own daughter. The small apartment she returned to each morning reflected this emotional minimalism. Functional furniture, practical decorations, nothing that demanded too much emotional investment. She had books, but few personal photographs, plants, but no pets, a comfortable bed, but no one to share it with. It was the living space of someone who had organized her life around absence rather than presence. Her daily routine after work involved a careful ritual of decompression. She would sit in her kitchen with a cup of tea, still wearing her scrubs, and mentally review the night's cases. Not for medical accuracy, her skills were sharp enough that clinical mistakes rarely troubled her sleep, but for the human moments she might have handled differently. The anxious parent she might have reassured more effectively. The frightened patient who might have benefited from an extra moment of eye contact. These quiet morning reflections had become both penance and preparation, a way of processing the emotional weight of her work while maintaining the professional distance that allowed her to return each night. Ellen understood that her effectiveness as a nurse depended on her ability to care without becoming consumed, to remain present without becoming attached. But lately, something had begun shifting in her carefully constructed equilibrium. Perhaps it was the approach of her retirement, still years away, but visible on the horizon like a distant shore. Perhaps it was the accumulation of too many nights spent with other people's families while her own remained estranged. Or perhaps it was simply the weight of years spent witnessing human suffering without allowing herself to fully feel its impact. The little girl's cries from the supply room had cut through Ellen's professional armor with surgical precision, finding vulnerability she thought she had sealed long ago. Standing in the hallway with that brass key in her hand, Ellen felt the familiar weight of institutional responsibility warring with something less familiar. A maternal instinct that her years of clinical detachment had never quite managed to extinguish. In 30 years of nursing, Ellen had learned to trust her instincts about medical emergencies. Tonight, those same instincts were telling her that whatever waited behind that locked door would challenge not just her professional protocols, but the careful emotional architecture she had built around her heart. The key turned with a soft click that seemed to echo through Ellen's chest. As the supply room door swung open, the antiseptic smell of medical supplies mixed with something else, the unmistakable scent of human desperation and unwashed bodies, that spoke of days without proper shelter. In the far corner, partially hidden behind stacks of IV bags and boxes of gauze, lay a woman who couldn't have been much older than Ellen's own daughter. Her dark skin had an ashen quality that immediately triggered Ellen's clinical assessment protocols, and her breathing was shallow and labored. Beside her, barely visible in the dim light filtering in from the hallway, sat the little girl whose cries had drawn Ellen here. "Mama, someone's here," the child whispered, her small hand resting protectively on the woman's shoulder. Up close, Ellen could see that the girl was perhaps 7 or 8, with intelligent eyes that held far too much worry for someone her age. Her clothes were clean but worn, and she had the careful posture of a child who had learned to make herself small and invisible. Ellen's nursing instincts took over, overriding the administrative voice in her head that was already cataloguing the violations this situation represented. She knelt beside the woman, her fingers automatically seeking a pulse point. The heartbeat was rapid and thready, and the woman's skin felt clammy to the touch, classic signs of dehydration and possible diabetic complications. "What's your mama's name, sweetheart?" Ellen asked gently, her voice taking on the calm, reassuring tone she reserved for frightened children. Maria Santos, and I'm Zuri." The little girl's voice was barely above a whisper, but Ellen caught the fierce protectiveness in it. "Is she going to be okay? She's been sleeping a lot, and she won't wake up all the way." Ellen performed a quick visual assessment while maintaining her gentle tone. Maria's breathing was definitely labored, and there was a sweet, fruity smell to her breath that suggested diabetic ketoacidosis. Her lips were dry and cracked, and when Ellen gently pinched the skin on her hand, it remained tented, a clear sign of severe dehydration. "How long has your mama been like this?" Ellen asked, already mentally calculating the supplies she would need. 2 days, maybe 3. "We've been staying here at night because it's warm, and Mama said the doctors here were nice." Zuri's explanation came in careful whispers, as if she understood instinctively that their situation was precarious. "I tried to give her water from the sink, but she couldn't keep it down." Ellen's heart clenched at the image of this small child trying to care for her unconscious mother in a supply closet, but her professional training kept her voice steady. "Zuri, I need to help your mama right now. Can you tell me, does she take any medicine, any pills or shots?" The little girl nodded eagerly, reaching into a small backpack that Ellen hadn't initially noticed. From it, she pulled out an empty insulin pen and a glucometer with test strips. "She uses this, but it's been empty for a while. We couldn't—" Her voice broke slightly. "We couldn't get more." The picture was becoming devastatingly clear. Maria was diabetic, had run out of insulin, and was now in the early stages of diabetic ketoacidosis, a potentially fatal condition that required immediate medical intervention. The fact that she was still breathing meant they had found her. In time, but not by much, Ellen made a decision that would have seemed impossible to her just hours earlier. Instead of calling for an emergency admission, which would trigger a cascade of paperwork, insurance verification, and potentially involve child services, she helped Maria to her feet and guided both mother and daughter to an empty examination room. "We're going to take care of your mama," Ellen assured Zuri as she helped Maria onto the examination table. The woman was semi-conscious now, responding to voices but not fully oriented. "But I need you to be very quiet and very brave. Can you do that for me?" Zuri nodded solemnly, settling into the chair beside the examination table with the practiced patience of a child who had spent many hours in medical waiting rooms. Ellen worked quickly, starting an IV line and drawing blood for glucose testing. Maria's blood sugar was dangerously high, over 400, and her ketones were elevated. Ellen began fluid resuscitation while her mind raced through the protocols for DKA management. She would need insulin, but more immediately, Maria needed fluids and electrolyte replacement. As she worked, a crayon drawing fluttered from Zuri's pocket to the floor. Ellen glanced at it while adjusting the IV drip. A simple picture of a house with two stick figures labeled Mama and Me in careful child's handwriting. The house was colored in bright yellows and blues, with a sun overhead and flowers in the yard. It was the drawing of a child who still believed in happy endings, despite evidence to the contrary. "That's our house," Zuri explained quietly, noticing Ellen's attention. "Well, it was our house, before we had to leave." Ellen picked up the drawing and smoothed it carefully before handing it back. "It's beautiful. Did you draw this for your mama?" "I draw her pictures when she's sad. Sometimes when her sugar gets low, she cries, and the pictures make her feel better." Zuri's matter-of-fact explanation carried the weight of responsibilities no child should bear. Over the next hour, as Maria's condition gradually stabilized, Ellen pieced together their story through gentle questions and careful observation. They had been evicted from their apartment 6 weeks ago when Maria lost her job due to increasingly frequent diabetic episodes. Without insurance, her insulin had become prohibitively expensive. A single pen cost more than she could spend on groceries for a week. They had been living in their car until it was repossessed 2 weeks ago. Since then, they had bounced between homeless shelters, friends' couches, and when those options ran out, any warm, safe space they could find. The clinic's supply room had seemed like a blessing. Medical help was nearby if Maria's condition worsened, and Zuri could stay warm while her mother struggled with her illness. "She always takes care of everyone else first," Zuri confided, as her mother's breathing became more regular. "Even when she doesn't feel good, she makes sure I eat first, that I have a safe place to sleep. She tells me stories so I won't be scared." Ellen found herself studying this small girl who spoke with the gravity of someone much older. Zuri had the kind of resilience that came from necessity, but underneath Ellen could see the child she should be allowed to be. Curious, creative, deserving of security and unconditional love. As Maria began to regain consciousness, Ellen faced a decision that would test everything she believed about her professional responsibilities. The protocol was clear. This was a case for social services, for emergency admission, for official channels that would separate this mother and daughter while bureaucracy determined their fate. But looking at Zuri's drawing, at the careful way the little girl monitored her mother's breathing, at the obvious bond between them despite their desperate circumstances, Ellen found herself questioning protocols for the first time in decades. Maria's eyes fluttered open, immediately scanning the room until they found Zuri. "Mi amor," she whispered, her voice hoarse but filled with relief. "Are you okay? Did I scare you?" "I'm okay, Mama. The nice nurse is helping you. She has medicine to make you better." Zuri moved to her mother's side, taking her hand with the fierce protectiveness that had characterized her throughout the crisis. Ellen watched this interaction with growing recognition. This was love in its purest form, imperfect, complicated by circumstances, but absolutely unshakable. It reminded her of feelings she had buried under years of professional distance and personal regrets. Standing in that examination room, Ellen Morrison faced a choice that would define not just the immediate future of this small family, but the direction of her own carefully ordered life. Ellen's decision crystallized in the space between one heartbeat and the next. She quietly closed the examination room door and turned to face Maria, who was now fully conscious but still weak from her ordeal. "Maria, I need to ask you some difficult questions, and I need honest answers," Ellen said, her voice carrying the authority of 3 decades in medicine. "How long has it been since you've had consistent access to insulin?" Maria's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. 3 weeks, maybe 4. I was rationing what I had left, trying to make it stretch, but—" She gestured helplessly. "There's no stretching medicine when your body needs what it needs." Ellen nodded grimly. She had seen this scenario too many times. Diabetics forced to choose between medication and rent, between insulin and food for their children. The bent and worn Medicaid card that Maria pulled from her pocket told the rest of the story. Multiple denied stamps covered the surface, creating a paper trail of bureaucratic indifference to human suffering. "The system failed you," Ellen said simply, a statement that would have seemed like professional heresy just hours earlier. "But you're here now and you're stable. The question is, what happens next?" She began explaining Maria's options with the careful precision she usually reserved for complex medical procedures. Official admission would trigger an avalanche of paperwork, insurance verification, and social services involvement. Maria would receive excellent medical care, but Zuri would likely be placed in emergency foster care while investigators determined whether Maria was fit to parent while homeless and uninsured. "How long?" Maria asked, her hand tightening around Zuri's. "Weeks, maybe months. The system moves slowly, and reunification requires stable housing, consistent income, proof of ability to manage your medical condition." Ellen had seen families torn apart by these requirements, good parents losing their children not to abuse or neglect, but to poverty. The alternative Ellen was considering felt like stepping off a cliff. She could treat Maria quietly, help her stabilize, and provide the medications she needed while they figured out long-term solutions. It would mean falsifying records, hiding their presence from day-shift staff, and potentially risking her career if discovered. "Why would you do this for us?" Maria asked, as if reading Ellen's thoughts. "You don't even know us." Ellen looked at Zuri, who was listening to this adult conversation with the serious attention of a child who understood that her future hung in the balance. In those intelligent, worried eyes, Ellen saw echoes of her own daughter at that age. The daughter who had learned not to depend on her mother being present for important moments. "Because 30 years ago, I was a single mother trying to hold everything together while working nights," Ellen said quietly. "Because I know what it's like to choose between your child's needs and impossible circumstances. And because—" She paused, surprising herself with the honesty, "because I think I forgot somewhere along the way that rules are supposed to serve people, not the other way around." Dr. Martinez chose that moment to appear in the doorway, his young face immediately registering the medical supplies Ellen had been using and the obvious signs of an unreported patient. Ellen watched him process the situation. The IV line, the Glucose meter readings, the small girl holding her mother's hand with desperate tenderness. "Ellen," he said carefully, "is there something I should know about?" The moments stretched between them, filled with the weight of professional obligations and institutional protocols. Ellen could see the conflict playing out in Roberto's expression, the idealistic resident who had entered medicine to help people wrestling with the realities of a system that often seemed designed to prevent that help. "This is Maria Santos and her daughter Zuri," Ellen said, making another decision that felt simultaneously terrifying and inevitable. "Maria is diabetic, was in early DKA when I found them. She's stable now, but they need our help in ways that don't appear in any procedure manual." She explained their situation while Roberto listened, his expression cycling through concern, understanding, and growing determination. Ellen had chosen her ally well. Roberto's idealism hadn't yet been crushed by the system's weight, and his recent residency training in emergency medicine had exposed him to the human cost of healthcare disparities. "What are you proposing?" he asked finally. "Unofficial treatment, medications through compassionate use samples, help finding resources for stable housing, time for Maria to get back on her feet without losing her daughter." Ellen outlined her plan with the same methodical approach she brought to complex medical cases. Roberto was quiet for a long moment, studying Maria and Zuri with the careful attention of someone weighing professional risks against human need. When he spoke, his voice carried the conviction that had drawn him to medicine in the first place. "What do you need from me?" The conspiracy that formed in that examination room over the next hour would have been unthinkable to Ellen just days earlier. Roberto would provide medical oversight and access to medication samples from pharmaceutical representatives. Ellen would coordinate care and manage the practical aspects of keeping Maria and Zuri hidden from administrative oversight. Frank, when brought into their confidence, contributed security knowledge and the kind of street wisdom that came from years of dealing with desperate people. "The day shift can't know," Ellen explained as they developed their protocol, "which means Maria needs to be mobile enough to leave the building before 6 a.m. and not return until after 11 p.m. We have about 7 hours each night to provide treatment and monitoring." It was an impossible schedule made barely possible by Maria's rapid improvement once proper insulin therapy was resumed. Within hours of treatment, her blood sugars had dropped to manageable levels, and her mental clarity was completely restored. The transformation reminded Ellen why she had fallen in love with nursing in the first place. The profound satisfaction of watching suffering transform into hope through skilled intervention. Zuri's role in their small rebellion proved equally important. Her presence softened the clinical atmosphere of their nocturnal treatments, and her obvious devotion to her mother provided emotional context that Ellen's years of professional detachment had taught her to ignore. Watching this child comfort her mother during blood draws, carefully organizing medications with the precision of a pharmacy technician, and maintaining hope despite impossible circumstances, Ellen began to remember feelings she thought she had successfully buried. The logistics were complex but manageable. Maria and Zuri would spend days in the city's public spaces, libraries, parks, community centers, returning each night for treatment and a safe place to rest. Ellen established a system of communication through the Homeless Services Network, an informal network of social workers, ministers, and community advocates who understood how to help people navigate survival on the margins. As dawn approached, and Maria prepared for their first day of this new routine, Ellen found herself facing emotions she hadn't experienced in decades. The fierce protectiveness she felt toward this small family reminded her of her own early years as a mother, when Sarah's well-being had seemed more important than her own survival. But it also forced her to confront the uncomfortable truth about her own choices. She had told herself that working nights, missing school programs, being absent for the small daily moments of parenthood was necessary sacrifice for financial security. Standing beside Maria, who was willing to risk everything for her daughter's safety, Ellen began to question whether her sacrifices had been necessary or simply convenient ways to avoid the emotional vulnerability that deep connection required. 3. Nights into their arrangement, Ellen found herself looking forward to Maria and Zuri's return to the clinic with an anticipation that surprised her. Their presence had transformed the sterile environment of her workplace into something more complex, still professional, but warmed by the particular energy that comes from shared purpose and small acts of rebellion against institutional indifference. Maria's recovery was remarkable. Proper insulin therapy and regular meals had restored not just her physical health, but her natural warmth and intelligence. She was, Ellen discovered, a former elementary school teacher who had lost her position when budget cuts eliminated her program. Her love of learning showed in the way she engaged Zuri in educational games during their long days in the city, turning survival into lessons in resourcefulness and adaptability. "She's teaching me about different kinds of clouds," Zuri reported. One evening as Ellen checked her mother's blood sugar levels, "and how to count in Spanish and French. Mama says education is something nobody can take away from you, even if they take everything else." Ellen glanced at Sarah's graduation photo, tucked inside her locker alongside medication schedules and emergency protocols. The image had taken on new weight over the past few days, a reminder not just of missed opportunities, but of the distance she had allowed to grow between herself and the person who should have mattered most. That night, during the quiet hours between patient visits, Ellen made a decision that felt almost as risky as her choice to help Maria and Zuri. She pulled out her phone and scrolled to Sarah's number, a contact she hadn't activated in nearly 2 years. The phone rang 4 times before Sarah's voice, cautious and slightly surprised, answered. "Mom, is everything okay?" Ellen felt the familiar tightness in her chest that accompanied conversations with her daughter, the weight of accumulated silences and careful distances. "I'm fine. I wanted to hear your voice." The pause that followed contained years of complicated history. Sarah had learned not to expect spontaneous expressions of affection from her mother, just as Ellen had trained herself not to reach out without specific practical reasons. "Are you sure you're okay? You sound different," Sarah said, and Ellen could hear the mix of concern and confusion in her daughter's voice. "I'm working nights, as usual, but I've been thinking about you, about us." The words felt foreign in Ellen's mouth, like speaking a language she had once been fluent in, but had forgotten through disuse. "I know I wasn't always present when you were growing up. The work, the schedule. I told myself it was necessary, but I think I was also hiding behind it." Another pause, this one filled with surprise rather than wariness. "Mom, what's brought this on?" Ellen looked across the break room to where Zuri was sleeping on a makeshift bed of clean blankets, her small hand still clutching the crayon drawing of their imagined home. Maria sat beside her daughter, reading a medical textbook Ellen had lent her, staying informed about her condition with the thoroughness of a teacher-turned-student. "I'm watching a mother and daughter who have nothing except each other, and their love is so fierce, so present. It's making me realize what I missed. With you, what I chose to miss." Ellen's voice grew steadier as she spoke truths she had avoided for decades. "I want to do better. I know it might be too late for some things, but maybe not for everything." The silence stretched long enough that Ellen wondered if the call had been disconnected. When Sarah finally spoke, her voice was softer, carrying echoes of the little girl who had once waited up for her mother to come home from work. "I'm not sure what to say. This is not a conversation I expected to have with you, ever." Sarah paused, then added, but I'm glad you called. I've missed you, too, even when I was angry about missing you." They talked for 20 minutes, longer than they had spoken in years. Sarah shared details about her work, her relationship with her partner David, her small apartment with its view of Puget Sound. Ellen found herself genuinely curious about her daughter's life, asking questions that went beyond polite check-ins to real interest in who Sarah had become. Would you be open to talking again soon?" Ellen asked as the conversation naturally wound down. "Maybe we could try this more often." "I'd like that," Sarah said, and Ellen could hear the tentative hope in her voice. "Maybe next week, same time." After the call ended, Ellen sat in the quiet break room, feeling simultaneously exhausted and energized. Emotional vulnerability was exhausting when you were out of practice, but it was also oddly liberating, like stretching muscles that had been held rigid for too long. Dr. Martinez found her there an hour later, studying medication protocols with the kind of focused attention she usually reserved for complex medical procedures. "How are our unofficial patients?" he asked, settling into the chair across from her with his own cup of coffee. "Better every day. Maria's glucose control is excellent now that she has consistent access to insulin. Her knowledge base is impressive. She's been reading everything I give her about diabetes management." Ellen showed him Maria's carefully maintained blood sugar log, filled with neat notations and patterns that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of her condition. "And administratively?" Roberto's question carried the weight of their shared risk. "So far, so good. Frank has been invaluable. He knows every security camera angle and shift change in the building. No one from day shift has asked questions, and I've been careful about supply usage." Ellen had developed systems for tracking every medication, every supply item, ensuring that their unofficial treatment wouldn't be detected through inventory discrepancies. "What about long-term? This can't continue indefinitely." It was a question Ellen had been avoiding, but Roberto's practical concern forced her to confront the limitations of their arrangement. Maria needed stable housing, consistent income, and legal access to health care. Zuri needed enrollment in school, routine pediatric care, and the security that came with permanent shelter. "I've been in contact with Haven House," Ellen said, referring to a local non-profit that provided transitional housing for families in crisis. "They have a waiting list, but Maria's teaching background and medical stability make her a strong candidate. The challenge is timing. They need 30 days of documented stability before admission." It was a catch-22 that characterized much of the social safety net. Help was available for people who could prove they didn't desperately need it. Maria and Zuri were stable only because of Ellen's willingness to bend the rules, but that stability couldn't be officially documented without risking the intervention that might destroy it. "There's something else," Roberto said carefully. "Doctor, Jen mentioned seeing supply discrepancies during last week's inventory. Nothing dramatic, but enough to trigger a more thorough audit, and Administrator Webb has been asking questions about after-hours usage patterns." Ellen felt the familiar knot of anxiety that accompanied all her interactions with hospital administration. Patricia Webb represented everything Ellen had learned to navigate carefully over the years. Bureaucratic efficiency, prioritized over human consideration. Cost control, elevated above compassionate care. "How much time do we have?" Ellen asked. "Hard to say. Webb moves slowly, but when she acts, it's comprehensive. Days, maybe a week before she starts pulling detailed records." Ellen nodded, already calculating the variables involved in accelerating their plans for Maria and Zuri's transition to independence. The window for their informal arrangement was closing, but perhaps that was appropriate. What had begun as an emergency intervention needed to evolve into sustainable solutions. That night, as she helped Maria administer her evening insulin dose, Ellen reflected on how much had changed in just a few days. She was still the same competent professional nurse, but something fundamental had shifted in her approach to the work. Rules still mattered, but they had become tools rather than masters. The woman who had built her identity around institutional compliance was discovering the deep satisfaction that came from institutional resistance, when that resistance served love. Ellen's patient log had become a work of creative fiction. Each night, she carefully documented her official cases while omitting any trace of Maria and Zuri's presence in the clinic. The night shift log that had once been a straightforward record of medical encounters now required the kind of careful choreography she had never imagined needing in her nursing career. "Zuri's becoming quite the little nurse," Dr. Martinez observed one evening as he watched the 8-year-old carefully organize her mother's medications into a weekly pill organizer. The child had absorbed medical terminology and procedures with the quick intelligence that came from necessity, learning to read glucose meters and calculate insulin ratios with precision that impressed both medical professionals. "She shouldn't have to be," Maria said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of parental guilt that Ellen recognized all too well. "She should be worried about homework and friends, not whether her mama's blood sugar is stable." Ellen looked up from her charting, struck by the parallel between Maria's words and her own memories of Sarah taking on adult responsibilities while Ellen worked her demanding schedule. The difference was that Maria's circumstances had been imposed by poverty and illness, while Ellen's had been chosen, a distinction that made her historical absence from her daughter's life even more difficult to reconcile. "Children are more resilient than we give them credit for," Ellen said, though she wasn't sure if she was reassuring Maria or herself. "And Zuri knows she's loved. That makes all the difference." Over the past week, Zuri had indeed become an unofficial mascot for their small rebellion. Frank had taken to saving magazines from the waiting room for her, and Dr. Martinez had begun explaining medical procedures in terms she could understand. But it was Ellen who found herself most affected by the child's presence. Zuri's questions were endless and intelligent. She wanted to know why her mother's body couldn't make insulin anymore, how the medications worked, and what other people did when they couldn't afford medicine. Ellen found herself explaining complex physiological processes in simple terms, remembering the joy she had once taken in teaching, something she had lost somewhere in the routine of clinical efficiency. "Miss Ellen," Zuri asked one night while her mother slept, "why do some people have to choose between medicine and food? Mama says it's complicated, but it seems like everyone should be able to stay healthy." The question hung in the air with the kind of moral clarity that only children possessed. Ellen struggled to find an answer that was both honest and age-appropriate, finally settling on, "Sometimes grown-up systems get so complicated that they forget what they're supposed to do. Your mama's right. It is complicated. But that doesn't make it right." Ellen had begun reaching out to community resources with increasing urgency. The housing situation remained critical. Maria and Zuri couldn't survive indefinitely on public library days and clinic nights. She had connected them with St. Matthew's Community Kitchen for reliable meals and the Downtown Resource Center for shower facilities and clothing assistance. But each community resource came with its own requirements and limitations. Haven House still had them on a waiting list. The city's emergency housing program was overwhelmed and underfunded. Transitional housing required documentation that homeless families rarely possessed, proof of income, medical records, references from previous landlords. Ellen found herself navigating a labyrinth of social services that seemed designed more to discourage than to help. Each phone call revealed another layer of bureaucracy, another hoop to jump through, another form to complete. She was gaining a visceral understanding of the obstacles that kept families like Maria and Zuri trapped in cycles of instability. "I never realized how much work it is to be poor," Ellen confided to Frank during one of their quiet conversations. "The amount of time and energy required just to access basic services, it's like having a full-time job with no pay." Frank nodded grimly. And if you actually have a job, you can't take time off to stand in line at social services. Catch-22 doesn't begin to cover it. The emotional toll of their arrangement was becoming evident in ways Ellen hadn't anticipated. She found herself thinking about Maria and Zuri during her days off, worrying about their safety when they were out of her sight. The professional distance that had protected her for decades was eroding, replaced by a maternal concern that felt both foreign and familiar. Her conversations with Sarah had become a weekly highlight, though they remained tentative and careful. They were rebuilding their relationship one phone call at a time, learning to navigate the space between their shared history and their separate lives. "I'm proud of what you're doing," Sarah had said during their most recent call, after Ellen had carefully shared the story of helping Maria and Zuri without revealing the full extent of her rule-breaking. "It sounds like you're remembering why you became a nurse in the first place." Ellen had been surprised by how much her daughter's approval meant to her. For years she had told herself that Sarah's distance was a natural part of adult independence. But these conversations were revealing how much of that distance had been Ellen's own creation, a defensive response to guilt she had never fully acknowledged. The administrative pressure was building steadily. Dr. Chen had mentioned the inventory, discrepancies to Roberto twice more, and Administrator Webb had begun conducting unscheduled walkthroughs of the night shift. Ellen had developed a system of early warning through Frank's security radio, but the stress of constant vigilance was exhausting. "We need to accelerate the timeline," Ellen told Maria one night as they reviewed housing applications. "I don't think we have much longer before the administration starts asking questions we can't answer." Maria nodded, her expression serious but not panicked. Over the past 2 weeks, she had regained not just her physical health, but her natural confidence and problem-solving abilities. "I've been thinking about that too. What if I apply directly to some of the schools that are hiring substitute teachers? The pay isn't great, but it's income, and it would give us some legitimacy for housing applications." Ellen felt a surge of admiration for Maria's resilience and resourcefulness. Despite everything she had endured, homelessness, medical crisis, the daily uncertainty of survival, she was still thinking strategically about building a better future for herself and her daughter. "That's brilliant," Ellen said. "And with your blood sugar stable, you could handle the physical demands of classroom work. Do you have the necessary documentation?" "Most of it. My teaching certificate is still valid, and I have my transcripts stored digitally. The challenge will be explaining the gap in employment and providing references without revealing our current situation." They spent the next hour crafting a narrative that was both honest and strategic. Maria had taken time off to care for family health issues, had been working as a private tutor, was ready to return to formal classroom work. It wasn't entirely false, and it provided the kind of coherent story that hiring managers expected. Ellen found herself drawing on skills she had developed through decades of advocating for her patients, but applying them in new ways. She helped Maria practice interview responses, proofread application letters, and strategize about which opportunities might be most promising. "You're good at this," Maria observed after they had fine-tuned her resume. "Have you ever thought about social work? You have the right combination of practical skills and genuine caring." The comment caught Ellen off guard. She had spent so many years defining herself narrowly as a nurse that she had never considered how her skills might translate to other forms of helping. But Maria's observation made her think about the satisfaction she was finding in this broader kind of advocacy. "Work. I'm 62 years old," Ellen replied. "Bit late for career changes. My grandmother went back to school at 75. Zuri piped up from her corner, where she was working on a coloring book Frank had brought her. "She said learning never gets old. Only people do." Ellen laughed despite herself, charmed by the child's earnest wisdom. Zuri had a way of cutting through adult complications with simple truths that made everything seem more possible. As the night wore on, Ellen reflected on how much her perspective had shifted over the past few weeks. The work that had once felt routine and predictable now carried emotional weight and moral complexity. She was still providing medical care, but she was also providing hope, and discovering that hope was as essential to healing as any medication she could administer. The risks were real and growing. Administrator Webb's scrutiny was intensifying, and Ellen knew that discovery would mean not just the end of her career, but potential legal consequences for everyone involved. Yet for the first time in years, she felt truly alive in her work, connected to its deeper purpose in ways she had forgotten were possible. She was learning that some forms of caring required breaking rules, and some forms of healing happened outside the boundaries of official protocols. It was a lesson that was transforming not just her approach to nursing, but her understanding of what it meant to love responsibly. Administrator Patricia Webb's announcement arrived through the hospital's internal messaging system on a Wednesday morning, just as Ellen was finishing her shift. The subject line read, "Enhanced Quality Assurance Protocols," but Ellen's 30 years of institutional experience translated it immediately. Someone was about to be scrutinized, audited, and potentially sacrificed on the altar of regulatory compliance. Effective immediately, all departments will implement enhanced documentation procedures for medication dispensing, supply usage, and patient care protocols. The memo began. Random audits will be conducted to ensure adherence to Joint Commission standards and appropriate resource allocation. Ellen felt the familiar tightness in her chest that accompanied administrative threats to her carefully constructed professional world. But underneath the anxiety was something new, a fierce protectiveness that had nothing to do with her own career and everything to do with Maria and Zuri's safety. Dr. Martinez found her in the parking lot, the memo still glowing on her phone screen. "You saw it too?" "Webb doesn't do anything randomly," Ellen said grimly. "Someone has raised red flags, and she's casting a wide net to see what she catches." "What do we do?" Ellen looked at the young resident, remembering her own early years in nursing, when institutional authority had seemed both omnipresent and benevolent. Roberta was about to learn what she had discovered over decades, that sometimes caring for patients required treating administrators as adversaries. We get Maria and Zuri to safety before Webb's audit reaches our department, which means we have maybe 48 hours to accelerate every plan we've been developing. That evening, as Ellen waited for Maria and Zuri to arrive for their nightly medical check, she made a phone call she had been avoiding for 2 years. Her finger hovered over Sarah's number before she finally pressed dial, knowing that what she needed to say couldn't wait for their scheduled weekly conversation. "Mom, is everything okay? You're calling off schedule." Sarah's voice carried immediate concern, a daughter's instinctive response to unexpected contact from a parent who followed. Rigid routines. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to give me an honest answer," Ellen said, surprising herself with the directness of her approach. "If you were in trouble, real trouble, the kind where you might lose everything, would you call me for help?" The silence that followed was loaded with years of complicated history. Ellen could practically hear Sarah processing the question, weighing honesty against the careful politeness that had characterized their relationship for so long. "Mom, that's not fair. You've spent my entire adult life making it clear that you prefer emotional distance and professional obligations over personal relationships. You can't ask me that question and expect—" "You're right," Ellen interrupted, feeling the truth of her daughter's words settle in her chest like a physical weight. "I trained you not to depend on me. I trained you not to expect me to be available for the things that matter. I told myself it was teaching you independence, but really I was protecting myself from having to choose between my work and my love for you. Another pause, this one softer. Mom, what's happening? You've never talked like this before. Ellen looked across the empty clinic waiting room, thinking about Maria's willingness to risk everything for Zuri's welfare, about the fierce love that had kept a small family together despite impossible circumstances. I'm watching a mother who would literally die for her child, and I'm realizing that I spent your childhood dying for strangers instead. I don't know if it's too late to change that, but I want to try. I want to be someone you could call if you needed help. Sarah's voice caught. I don't know what to say. This is everything I wanted to hear from you for 20 years, and I don't know how to trust it now. You don't have to trust it yet, Ellen said gently, but maybe you could let me try to earn that trust, starting now. They talked for an hour, the longest conversation they had shared since Sarah left home for college. Ellen found herself revealing pieces of her inner life that she had kept carefully hidden, her regrets about missed school plays and forgotten birthdays, her fear that emotional closeness would make her less effective at work, her growing understanding that professional competence was no substitute for personal connection. I'm scared, Sarah admitted as their conversation wound down. I'm scared of hoping for a relationship we've never had. What if you can't maintain this? What if the work takes over again? Ellen thought about Maria and Zuri, about the choice between institutional compliance and human love that she faced every night. I can't promise I'll be perfect, but I can promise that I finally understand what matters most. And it's not the work. It's never been the work. When Maria and Zuri arrived that night, Ellen could see the strain showing in both their faces. 2 weeks of unstable housing and constant uncertainty were taking their toll, despite the medical progress and practical gains they had made. Mama had to throw away one of her insulin pens today, Zuri reported quietly as Ellen performed their routine blood sugar check. Someone at the shelter said it looked expensive and they might steal it. Ellen felt a surge of anger at the cruel irony. A medication that was keeping Maria alive had to be hidden because its value made it a theft target among people who had nothing. That's the last pen we lose, Ellen said firmly. Tomorrow we're going to change how we handle this. She had been working on a plan that pushed far beyond the boundaries of their current arrangement. Through her connections in the nursing community, Ellen had learned about a network of healthcare providers who operated outside official channels, an underground railroad for families navigating medical crises without insurance or documentation. There's a house, Ellen explained to Maria as Zuri colored quietly nearby. It's run by a retired social worker named Grace Patterson. She takes in families who are between circumstances, people who need time to stabilize without official oversight. Medical professionals volunteer their services and everything happens off the books. Maria looked up sharply. What's the cost? No money, but Grace runs background checks, requires commitment to job searching or education, and expects families to contribute to household maintenance. It's not charity, it's community. Ellen watched Maria process this information, seeing the hope and wariness warring in her expression. After weeks of depending on Ellen's risky generosity, the prospect of official help felt almost too good to be trusted. How long can families stay? Usually 3 to 6 months, long enough to find work, save for housing deposits, get medical situations stable. Grace has been doing this for 15 years, and she has connections throughout the city for job placement and permanent housing. And they would take us, even though, especially because, Ellen interrupted gently, Grace specifically helps families who fall through the cracks of official services, single mothers, undocumented immigrants, people with medical conditions that make them unemployable by conventional standards. She understands that sometimes good people need help that comes without judgment. Ellen had already spoken with Grace, providing a careful summary of Maria and Zuri's situation without revealing the full extent of their current arrangement. Grace had space available and was willing to meet with them the following evening. "There's one condition," Ellen continued. "This transition has to happen quickly. The hospital administration is conducting audits, and our current arrangement has an expiration date measured in days, not weeks." As they prepared for what might be their last night in the clinic, Ellen felt the bitter sweetness that came with successful healing. She had helped save Maria's life and preserve their family unit, but the cost had been her own transformation, from someone who followed rules without question to someone who understood that love sometimes required breaking. Systems designed to prevent it. Standing in the quiet clinic, watching Zuri help her mother organize medications with practiced efficiency, Ellen realized that she had learned as much as she had taught. These two remarkable people had shown her that professional competence without emotional courage was just elaborate cowardice. They had taught her that some forms of healing couldn't be documented in medical records, and some forms of love couldn't be contained by institutional protocols. Ellen was organizing Maria's discharge medications when the piece of paper fell from Zuri's backpack. It fluttered to the floor like a dying leaf, its official letterhead immediately catching Ellen's trained eye. She picked it up reflexively, intending to hand it back, but the words "custody petition" and "emergency court order" stopped her cold. The document was dated 3 weeks earlier, around the time Maria and Zuri had first sought shelter in the clinic's supply room. Ellen's hands trembled slightly as she read the legal language that painted a devastating picture of their situation. James Santos, Maria's ex-husband and Zuri's father, had filed for emergency custody based on allegations of medical neglect and housing instability. The petition claimed that Maria's diabetes management was endangering Zuri, that their homelessness constituted child abandonment, and that James could provide the stable home environment that Zuri deserved. But it was the restraining order attached to the custody petition that made Ellen's blood run cold. James had convinced a family court judge that Maria posed a flight risk and had been granted authority to involve law enforcement in locating and recovering Zuri. The order specifically mentioned that James had been searching homeless shelters and medical facilities throughout the city. "Maria," Ellen called softly, her voice carefully controlled, despite the alarm bells ringing in her head. "Could you come here for a moment?" Maria approached with the easy confidence that had developed over their weeks of routine medical care. But her expression shifted immediately when she saw the document in Ellen's hands. "Where did you get that?" Maria's voice was barely above a whisper, but Ellen could hear the terror underneath. "It fell from Zuri's backpack." "Maria, why didn't you tell me about this?" Maria sank into a chair, her face cycling through emotions that Ellen recognized from years of emergency medicine. The look of someone whose worst fears were materializing despite their best efforts to prevent them. "Because I knew you'd have to follow protocol if you knew, because I couldn't risk losing her." Maria's words came in a rush, years of suppressed fear finally finding voice. He's not violent exactly, but he's controlling, and he uses the system to maintain that control. He knows I can't afford lawyers or stable housing. He knows the courts will see a homeless diabetic mother and make assumptions. Ellen felt the familiar weight of systemic injustice, but now it carried personal stakes that made her chest tight with rage. "Tell me everything. No more protecting me from the complexity." The story that emerged over the next hour recontextualized everything Ellen thought she understood about Maria and Zuri's situation. James Santos was a construction supervisor with steady income and a house in the suburbs, exactly the kind of stable presence that family courts preferred. His petition painted him as a concerned father trying to rescue his daughter from a mother whose medical condition and poor decisions had created dangerous living conditions. The custody hearing is scheduled for next week, Maria explained, her voice hollow with exhaustion. I've been trying to find legal representation, but pro bono family lawyers are rare, and private attorneys want retainers I could never afford. James knows this. He's counting on me not being able to mount an effective defense. But you've been managing your diabetes excellently since we stabilized your treatment, Ellen protested. Your blood sugars have been consistently within normal ranges. You've demonstrated perfect medication compliance, none of which I can prove in court, Maria interrupted gently. All my medical records show is the emergency room visit where they found me in DKA. Everything we've done here, she gestured around the clinic, doesn't exist officially. From the court's perspective, I'm still the same unstable diabetic who nearly died from medication non-compliance. Ellen stared at the legal documents, understanding for the first time the full scope of the trap Maria had been navigating. Every choice that had seemed rational in the context of immediate survival, avoiding official channels, accepting help that couldn't be documented, prioritizing Zuri's stability over her own legal protection, had inadvertently strengthened James's custody case. There's more, Maria continued, her voice growing smaller. James has been calling hospitals and clinics, claiming he's looking for his missing daughter. He's told them I kidnapped Zuri, that I'm mentally unstable and potentially dangerous. He's created an official narrative that makes me look like a fugitive. The implications hit Ellen like a physical blow. Their careful arrangement, which had seemed like compassionate healthcare provision, could now be interpreted as aiding a kidnapping. Dr. Martinez's medication samples, Frank's security accommodations, Ellen's falsified records, all of it could be reframed as conspiracy to conceal a child from her legal father. Jesus, Maria, if James finds out about this place, about what we've been doing, I know. That's why I couldn't tell you, because you've all been so good to us, and I couldn't bear the thought of getting you in legal trouble for trying to help. Maria's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. I thought I could handle the custody hearing on my own, thought maybe having stable medical treatment would be enough to demonstrate improvement. Ellen's mind raced through the legal and professional ramifications. Administrator Webb's audit suddenly took on new dimensions. If James had been calling medical facilities, he might have triggered the administrative scrutiny that was closing in on their department. The timing was too coincidental to ignore. Zuri, Ellen called gently to the little girl, who had been pretending to read a magazine, while obviously listening to every word of the adult conversation. Come here, sweetheart. The child approached with the careful composure that broke Ellen's heart. Too much awareness, too much responsibility for someone so young. Did you know about the papers from your daddy? Ellen asked, keeping her voice gentle but direct. Zuri nodded solemnly. Mama tried to hide them, but I saw her crying when she read them. I know he wants me to come live with him, but I don't want to leave Mama. She needs me to help with her medicine. Ellen felt the familiar, maternal fury that had been building over the past weeks crystallize into something harder and more determined. This was not just about medical care or bureaucratic compliance anymore. This was about a family being torn apart by systems that prioritized legal technicalities over human bonds. Maria, I need you to listen to me very carefully, Ellen said, her voice taking on the authority she used in medical emergencies. We're going to fight this, not just medically, but legally. You're not alone anymore. Ellen, you don't understand the risks. No, you don't understand, Ellen interrupted, surprising herself with her vehemence. I've spent 30 years following rules that were supposed to protect people, and I've watched those same rules destroy families like yours. I'm done being complicit in a system that punishes poverty and rewards manipulation. She began outlining a plan that would have seemed impossible to her just weeks earlier. Through her connections in the medical community, Ellen knew lawyers who specialized in family court cases involving medical complexity. She had colleagues who could provide expert testimony about Maria's diabetes management and Zuri's well-being. Most importantly, she had documentation, carefully maintained records that could prove Maria's medical stability and excellent parenting despite their challenging circumstances. "But the legal fees," Maria began. "Will be handled," Ellen said firmly. "There are organizations that specifically help families facing custody challenges related to health conditions, and if necessary, I have savings that have been sitting untouched for years." Dr. Martinez, who had been listening from the doorway, stepped into the conversation with the quiet determination Ellen had come to value in him. "I'll testify as Maria's treating physician," he said simply. "Everything we've documented here, the medication compliance, the blood sugar control, Zuri's obvious well-being, it's all medically relevant to the custody determination." Ellen felt a surge of gratitude for this young doctor who was willing to risk his career for principles that extended beyond official protocols. But she also felt the weight of responsibility for drawing him into a situation that could destroy his future in medicine. "Roberto, you need to understand what you're volunteering for. If this goes badly, we could all face legal consequences. Your residency, your career, some things are more important than career advancement," he said quietly, and Ellen heard echoes of her own transformation in his voice. As they developed their strategy for fighting James's custody petition, Ellen realized that her carefully constructed professional life was about to be permanently altered. There would be no going back to the comfortable distance of clinical detachment, no returning to the safety of institutional compliance. But looking at Maria and Zuri, seeing the hope beginning to replace terror in their expressions, Ellen knew she had finally found the courage to choose love over fear, not just in her personal relationships, but in her professional calling as well. The resignation letter sat on Ellen's kitchen table for 3 days before she finally sealed it in an envelope. She had written and rewritten it a dozen times, each version an attempt to find language that conveyed both professional regret and personal conviction. The final draft was simple, direct, and carried the weight of 30 years of institutional loyalty finally redirected toward human justice. "After careful consideration, I am submitting my resignation from City General's Community Clinic, effective immediately. This decision reflects my commitment to advocating for patients in ways that extend beyond the current scope of my institutional responsibilities." Ellen knew the letter would raise questions she wasn't prepared to answer officially, but it provided a clean exit strategy if Administrator Webb's audit exposed their arrangement before Maria's custody hearing could be resolved. More importantly, it represented Ellen's acceptance that some forms of caring required sacrificing professional security for moral clarity. The legal strategy session in attorney Margaret Chen's office had been both encouraging and sobering. Margaret specialized in family law cases involving medical complexity, and she understood immediately the intersection of custody manipulation and healthcare access that defined Maria and Zuri's situation. "James Santos is using a playbook I've seen before," Margaret had explained, her voice carrying the weary authority of someone who fought these battles regularly. "Men who want to maintain control over their ex-wives often weaponize the legal system, particularly when children are involved. His custody petition reads like a checklist of family court prejudices: unstable housing, medical non-compliance, flight risk behaviors. But Margaret had also identified weaknesses in James's case that could be exploited with proper documentation and expert testimony. The timing of his custody petition, filed immediately after Maria had lost her housing, suggested opportunism rather than genuine concern for Zuri's welfare. His failure to provide financial support during Maria's medical crisis could be framed as paternal neglect. Most significantly, Zuri's obvious emotional attachment to her mother and her sophisticated understanding of diabetes management demonstrated that Maria's parenting had been exemplary despite their circumstances. The challenge, Margaret continued, is that everything positive in Maria's favor has happened outside official channels. We need to create a legal record of her medical compliance and parenting competence that will withstand James's narrative of irresponsibility. This was where Ellen's documentation proved invaluable. Despite the informal nature of their arrangement, she had maintained meticulous records of Maria's blood glucose readings, medication adherence, and medical education progress. Dr. Martinez had prepared a comprehensive medical report that demonstrated not just clinical improvement, but sophisticated patient engagement with her treatment regimen. Ellen's records are actually more detailed than most official medical files, Margaret observed as she reviewed their documentation. The level of attention and care documented here contradicts every claim in James's petition. But preparing for the custody hearing meant exposing their entire arrangement to legal scrutiny. Ellen, Dr. Martinez, and Frank would all need to testify about their roles in providing unofficial support to Maria and Zuri. The hospital administration would inevitably discover the scope of their rule-bending, and professional consequences were certain. "I want everyone to understand what we're risking," Ellen told her small team during their final planning meeting. "Webb's audit is scheduled for Monday. The custody hearing is Thursday. We have 4 days to navigate both processes without compromising Maria and Zuri's case or destroying our own careers." Frank, whose security access had been essential to their arrangement, was the most vulnerable to immediate termination. Hospital security protocols were rigid, and his accommodations for Maria and Zuri represented clear violations of his professional responsibilities. 40 years I've worked security in this city," Frank said with characteristic gruffness. "Hospitals, office buildings, shopping centers. You know what I've learned? The rules are there to protect the institution, not the people inside it. Sometimes protecting people means breaking institutional rules." Dr. Martinez faced potentially career-ending consequences if his residency program discovered his involvement. Medical residents operated under strict oversight, and any deviation from approved protocols could result in dismissal from the program and permanent damage to his professional prospects. "My parents immigrated here so I could have opportunities." "They never had," Roberto said quietly. "They sacrificed everything for my education, my medical training. But they also taught me that knowledge without compassion is worthless, that privilege without service is selfish. I think they would understand why this matters." Ellen felt the weight of responsibility for bringing these good people into her moral rebellion. Their willingness to risk everything for Maria and Zuri's family reflected the kind of courage she had spent decades avoiding, and their faith in her judgment both humbled and terrified her. The phone call from Sarah came Tuesday evening, just as Ellen was reviewing testimony notes for the custody hearing. "Mom, I've been thinking about our conversation," Sarah said without preamble, "about being someone I could call for help. I want you to know that watching you take these risks for people you barely know, it's helping me believe that you might actually be there for me if I needed you." Ellen felt tears she hadn't expected. "I hope I get the chance to prove that to you. You already are. By choosing to love these strangers the way you never quite learned to love me. It's not the same thing, but it's a start." Their conversation lasted 2 hours, covering territory they had never navigated before. Sarah shared details about her relationship struggles, her career pressures, her own fears about emotional vulnerability. Ellen found herself offering the kind of maternal support she had withheld for decades, and discovering that emotional intimacy was a skill that could be relearned with practice and commitment. "Win or lose, what you're doing matters," Sarah said as their call wound down. "And Mom, I'm proud of you. Finally. Wednesday brought Administrator Webb's audit with the inevitability of a natural disaster. Ellen arrived at work to find Patricia. Webb installed in the break room with clipboards, computer printouts, and the predatory focus of someone who had found irregularities worth investigating. Nurse Morrison. Webb's voice carried the particular authority of bureaucratic power. I need to discuss some discrepancies in your supply usage and patient documentation over the past 3 weeks. Ellen felt the familiar tightness in her chest, but underneath the anxiety was something new, a calm acceptance of consequences that came from knowing she had chosen correctly, even if she had chosen dangerously. What specific discrepancies? Ellen asked, settling into the chair across from Webb with the composure she brought to medical emergencies. Insulin usage that doesn't correspond to documented diabetic patients, IV supplies administered without recorded procedures, examination room utilization during periods with no logged patient encounters. Webb's recitation was clinical, precise, and damning. Ellen nodded slowly, understanding that denial would only prolong the inevitable. Those discrepancies reflect medical care provided to patients whose circumstances required treatment outside standard documentation protocols. There are no circumstances that justify practicing medicine without proper documentation, Nurse Morrison. You understand that what you're describing constitutes multiple violations of hospital policy, state healthcare regulations, and potentially federal law. I understand the regulations, Ellen said quietly. I also understand that sometimes following regulations means allowing people to suffer or die when we have the power to help them. In this case, the regulations would have separated a mother from her daughter and condemned them both to continuing medical and housing instability. Webb's expression shifted from administrative annoyance to genuine shock. She had clearly expected Ellen to offer excuses or attempt damage control, not to acknowledge the violations while defending their moral necessity. Nurse Morrison, you're describing conspiracy to provide undocumented medical care. The professional and legal consequences are less important than the human consequences of turning away a diabetic mother and her 8-year-old daughter who were sleeping in supply closets because they had nowhere else to go. Ellen's voice remained steady, but her conviction was absolute. I've spent 30 years following protocols that prioritize institutional liability over patient welfare. I'm done with that version of nursing. The confrontation continued for another hour, with Webb documenting violations and Ellen providing careful, truthful responses that neither minimized their actions nor revealed details that might compromise. The custody hearing. By the end, Ellen's termination was inevitable, but she had managed to frame their arrangement as principled medical advocacy rather than reckless rule-breaking. Your employment is terminated effective immediately, Webb concluded. Hospital security will escort you from the building, and you are prohibited from returning to hospital property pending further investigation. Ellen nodded, feeling the strange lightness that came from finally abandoning pretense. I'll need to gather my personal items from my locker. As she cleaned out 30 years of accumulated professional life, commendation letters, continuing education certificates, the tarnished nursing pin that had marked her service, Ellen thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 weeks ago, she had been a competent, compliant nurse who followed rules without question. Today, she was unemployed, professionally compromised, and facing potential legal consequences. She had never felt more proud of her career in nursing. Thursday morning dawned grey and cold, appropriate weather for a custody hearing that would determine whether Ellen's rebellion had been worth the cost. As she dressed in her most professional attire, the armor of respectability that might help convince a family court judge that Maria deserved to keep her daughter, Ellen reflected on the transformation that had begun with the little girl's desperate, Cries outside a locked supply room door. Whatever happened in that courtroom, Ellen Morrison was no longer the woman who had spent decades hiding behind institutional protocols to avoid the messy complications of human love. She had finally learned the lesson that Maria and Zuri had been teaching her from the beginning, that some forms of caring require breaking systems, and some forms of love require risking everything. The family courthouse smelled of disinfectant and desperation, a combination that reminded Ellen uncomfortably of the hospital she would never return to. Maria sat beside attorney Margaret Chen at the plaintiff's table, her posture straight despite the weight of uncertainty that had shadowed her for weeks. She wore a borrowed suit that Ellen had provided, professional armor for a battle that would determine whether love could triumph over legal technicalities. Zuri waited in the hallway, with a court advocate, her small hands clutching the insulin pen that had become both symbol and lifeline for their family's survival. Ellen had explained to the child that she wouldn't be allowed in the courtroom, but that everything the adults said would be about keeping her and her mother together. "Remember," Zuri had whispered to Ellen before the proceedings began, "Mama needs her medicine every day, not just when someone is watching." The words carried the weight of a child's understanding that adult systems often failed to see what mattered most. James Santos entered the courtroom with the confident bearing of someone who had never doubted that institutions would support his version of reality. He was exactly as Ellen had imagined, well-dressed, professionally successful, accompanied by expensive legal representation that projected stability and respectability. Beside him sat his attorney, a sharp-featured woman whose briefcase bulged with documentation designed to prove Maria's unfitness as a mother. Judge Patricia Hernandez called the court to order with the brisk efficiency of someone who had presided over too many family destruction cases disguised as child welfare proceedings. Ellen, seated in the gallery behind Maria, felt the familiar weight of institutional authority, but now it carried personal stakes that made her chest tight with protective fury. James's attorney opened with a presentation that was both legally sound and morally devastating. She painted Maria as an irresponsible mother whose medical non-compliance had created dangerous living conditions for Zuri. The evidence was damning when stripped of context. Emergency room records showing severe diabetic ketoacidosis, documentation of homelessness, police reports of car repossession, and witness statements from shelter staff about Maria's periods of confusion and weakness. "Your Honor, the petitioner seeks emergency custody not to punish Ms. Santos, but to provide his daughter with the stable, medically supervised environment she deserves," James's attorney concluded. "Mr. Santos has maintained steady employment, owns his home, and has comprehensive health insurance that would ensure Zuri's ongoing medical and educational needs." Ellen watched Maria's face as this character assassination unfolded, seeing the careful composure that masked her growing despair. Everything James's attorney said was technically accurate, but it ignored the love, sacrifice, and extraordinary circumstances that had defined Maria's choices. Margaret Chen's opening statement began the work of recontextualizing the evidence. She outlined Maria's background as an experienced educator, her proactive approach to diabetes management when resources were available, and her extraordinary dedication to maintaining Zuri's stability despite impossible circumstances. "What we're really examining today," Margaret said, addressing Judge Hernandez directly, "is whether poverty and medical challenges disqualify an otherwise exemplary mother from raising her own child. The evidence will show that when Ms. Santos had access to appropriate medical care, her diabetes management was exemplary and her parenting was not just adequate, but exceptional." The first witness was Dr. Martinez, whose youth and obvious idealism provided credible contrast to the administrative efficiency of James's presentation. Roberto testified about Maria's rapid medical stabilization once proper treatment was available, her sophisticated understanding of diabetes management, and her consistent prioritization of Zuri's welfare even during her own health crisis. In my medical opinion, Roberto concluded, Ms. Santos demonstrates excellent potential for long-term diabetes management, given appropriate resources. Her temporary medical instability was directly related to lack of access to medication, not to personal irresponsibility or inability to manage her condition. Ellen was called as the second witness, and she approached the stand with the careful composure she had perfected over decades of high-pressure medical situations. Margaret's questions were designed to establish Ellen's credibility while revealing the extraordinary circumstances that had brought their small group together. Nurse Morrison, in your 30 years of clinical experience, how would you characterize Maria Santos's approach to medical care? Exemplary, Ellen replied without hesitation. Ms. Santos demonstrated the kind of informed engagement with her treatment that we hope to see from all patients. She asked intelligent questions, maintained detailed records, and prioritized medical compliance even when doing so required significant personal sacrifice. Can you elaborate on that sacrifice? Ellen felt the courtroom's attention focus on her response, understanding that this moment would define not just Maria's case, but her own transformation as well. Ms. Santos rationed her insulin to make it last longer, knowing that doing so risked her own health, but hoping to maintain some level of treatment until she could access more medication. She taught her daughter to monitor her symptoms and seek help when needed. She prioritized Zuri's nutritional needs over her own, even when food was scarce. And in your professional opinion, did these choices reflect irresponsible parenting or exceptional parenting under impossible circumstances? The latter, absolutely. Ellen's voice carried the conviction of someone who had finally learned to trust her own moral instincts over institutional protocols. James's attorney cross-examined Ellen with surgical precision, focusing on the unofficial nature of their treatment, arrangement, and the multiple hospital policies that had been violated. Each question was designed to portray Ellen as a rogue healthcare provider whose unprofessional conduct had enabled Maria's avoidance of proper medical oversight. Nurse Morrison, you provided medical treatment without proper documentation, dispensed medications outside established protocols, and allowed unauthorized individuals to remain in hospital facilities overnight. Do you consider these actions consistent with professional nursing standards? Ellen felt the weight of her career resting on her answer, but also the greater weight of Maria and Zuri's future. I consider those actions consistent with the oath I took when I became a nurse to advocate for patients' well-being, even when institutional systems fail to support that well-being. So you believe nurses should be allowed to decide which hospital policies to follow and which to ignore. I believe healthcare providers should be guided by patient welfare first and administrative compliance second. When those priorities conflict, I choose patient welfare. Ellen's response was calm, direct, and absolutely career-ending in any institutional healthcare setting. But as she looked across the courtroom at Maria, who was listening to this exchange with tears in her eyes, Ellen realized that some forms of professional suicide were actually forms of professional rebirth. She was no longer hiding behind institutional authority to avoid the emotional risks of genuine caring. The morning session concluded with James taking the stand to present his case for custody. His testimony was smooth, reasonable, and devastating in its portrayal of himself as a concerned father trying to rescue his daughter from an unstable situation. I love Zuri more than anything, he concluded, his voice carrying just the right combination of paternal devotion and reluctant determination. I don't want to take her from her mother, but I can't stand by and watch her suffer because of Maria's inability to maintain stable housing and medical care. During the lunch recess, Ellen found herself in the courthouse corridor with Maria and Zuri, all three of them processing the morning's testimony. The legal system was functioning exactly as designed, prioritizing stability over love, documentation over devotion, financial resources over emotional bonds. "Mama," Zuri said quietly, "are they going to make me live with Daddy?" Maria knelt to her daughter's eye level, her voice steady despite the fear Ellen could see in her expression. "I don't know, mi amor. But no matter what happens, you are loved. Always. And love doesn't disappear just because grown-ups make decisions about where you sleep." Ellen watched this exchange and understood that regardless of the legal outcome, she had witnessed something transformative. Maria and Zuri had taught her that authentic love required risking everything, and that the courage to choose human connection over professional security was not just admirable, but essential. The afternoon session would determine whether that lesson had come in time to make a difference. The afternoon session began with Margaret Chen calling Grace Patterson to the stand. The retired social worker brought 30 years of child welfare experience and the kind of moral authority that came from dedicating a career to protecting vulnerable families. Her testimony about the underground network of support for families, navigating system failures, provided crucial context for understanding why Maria had sought help outside official channels. Families like Ms. Santos and her daughter often fall through gaps in our social safety net, Grace explained to Judge Hernandez. They make too much money to qualify for some programs, too little for others. They have circumstances too complex for standardized assistance protocols. When official systems fail, communities create informal networks to prevent families from suffering unnecessarily. Grace's description of her transitional housing program and its success rate in helping families achieve stability provided a concrete alternative to the foster care placement that James was advocating. More importantly, her professional assessment of Maria and Zuri during their intake interview directly contradicted James's portrayal of an unstable, neglectful parent. Ms. Santos demonstrated exceptional parenting under extraordinary circumstances, Grace testified. Her daughter is well-adjusted, academically advanced, and shows clear evidence of secure attachment. These outcomes don't happen accidentally. They reflect consistent, loving parenting despite external challenges. The turning point came when Margaret called Zuri as a witness. Ellen had been dreading this moment, knowing that an 8-year-old child shouldn't have to testify about her own future, but understanding that Zuri's voice was essential to challenging James's narrative. Judge Hernandez spoke gently to Zuri, explaining that she would ask some questions about her life with her mother and that there were no wrong answers. Ellen watched the small girl approach the witness stand with the same careful composure she had shown throughout their weeks at the clinic. "Zuri, can you tell me about taking care of your mama when she gets sick?" Margaret asked, her voice soft but clear. "I help her test her blood sugar and make sure she takes her medicine at the right times," Zuri replied, her voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone of someone describing routine responsibilities. "When her sugar gets too low, I give her juice or crackers. When it gets too high, she needs her insulin shot. And who taught you how to help with these things?" "Mama taught me. She showed me all the numbers on the machine and what they mean. She said it's important for me to know so I can help keep her safe." Ellen felt tears threatening as she listened to this small child describe the sophisticated medical knowledge she had acquired out of necessity. Margaret's questions revealed not just Zuri's competence in assisting with diabetes management, but her obvious emotional security and intellectual development, despite their challenging circumstances. "Zuri, do you feel safe with your mama?" "Yes. Even when we didn't have a house, Mama made sure I was safe. She always fed me first, even when there wasn't enough food. She read me stories when I was scared. She told me we were having an adventure until we could find our real home again. Do you want to live with your daddy?" Zuri's pause was brief, but loaded with meaning. Daddy is nice, but he doesn't understand about Mama's medicine. Last time I visited him, he said she was just being dramatic about needing shots. He doesn't know how to test blood sugar or what to do if the numbers are wrong. Ellen watched James's expression shift as his daughter's testimony revealed the gaps in his understanding of Maria's medical needs. His confidence wavered slightly. Azuri continued describing specific instances where his dismissal of diabetes management had created dangerous situations. The cross-examination by James's attorney was brief and careful. Attacking an 8-year-old's credibility was unlikely to benefit their case, but Zuri's simple, honest responses to challenging questions only reinforced her competence and her clear preference for remaining with her mother. "Sometimes Mama and I don't have a lot of money," Zuri acknowledged in response to questions about their housing instability, "but we always have each other, and now we have friends like Miss Ellen and Dr. Roberto who help us when things get hard." When Zuri was excused from the witness stand, she walked directly to Maria, who gathered her daughter into a fierce embrace that spoke louder than any legal argument about the bond between them. Judge Hernandez called a 30-minute recess to review testimony and evidence. Ellen found herself in the courthouse corridor with her small group of rebels, all of them processing the morning's revelations about institutional power and human resilience. "Whatever happens," Dr. Martinez said quietly, "we did the right thing." Zuri's testimony proved that. Ellen nodded, feeling the truth of his words settle in her chest. They had chosen love over protocol, human welfare over institutional compliance. The legal and professional consequences were real, but they paled beside the moral clarity that came from finally acting on principles she had carried silently for decades. When court reconvened, Judge Hernandez's expression was thoughtful rather than stern. Ellen held her breath as the judge began her ruling, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether their rebellion had been heroic or simply destructive. This case presents a conflict between institutional stability and family preservation. Judge Hernandez began. The court must weigh the father's legitimate concerns about housing and medical stability against the clear evidence of strong maternal bonds and effective parenting despite challenging circumstances. Ellen felt Maria tense beside her as the judge continued her deliberation, each word carrying the weight of Zuri's future and their own transformation. 6 months later, Ellen stood in the sunny kitchen of Grace Patterson's transitional house, watching Maria prepare breakfast while Zuri worked on homework at the dining room table. The simple domestic scene carried profound significance, a family preserved, a system challenged, and lives transformed by the courage to choose love over compliance. Judge Hernandez's ruling had been a careful balance of legal precedent and human wisdom. She had denied James's petition for emergency custody while establishing a supervised visitation schedule that acknowledged his parental rights without disrupting Zuri's primary residence with Maria. More importantly, the judge had recognized the exceptional circumstances that had led to their housing instability and required James to provide financial support for Maria's medical care as part of his child support obligations. The court finds, Judge Hernandez had said in her final ruling, that while Ms. Santos's housing situation has been unstable, her parenting has been exemplary. The testimony demonstrates that even under extraordinary stress, she prioritized her daughter's welfare and maintained effective management of her medical condition when resources were available. The court sees no evidence of neglect or unfitness, only evidence of a mother doing her best under circumstances that would challenge any parent. Ellen had wept openly in the courtroom as Maria and Zuri embraced, their relief and joy too profound for quiet celebration. The legal victory had vindicated not just their family bond, but the choices Ellen and her colleagues had made to support them outside official channels. The professional consequences had been swift and comprehensive. Ellen's nursing license was under review by the state board, though Margaret Chen was confident that the circumstances would result in censure rather than revocation. Dr. Martinez had been dismissed from his residency program, but had already been accepted into a family medicine track at a community health center that valued his advocacy skills alongside his clinical competence. Frank had been terminated from hospital security, but found work with a non-profit organization that provided safety services for homeless encampments.